For 36 years spanning 1787 to 1823, prosperous families throughout colonial America dispatched their problematic sons to St. Augustine Seminary in Virginia seeking religious instruction and spiritual reform. Not one of those young men ever made it back home. Church documentation shows 247 students registered across this period, yet not a single one completed ordination as a priest. What became of them stayed an unsolved mystery until 1998, when construction workers uncovering renovations stumbled upon records revealing the seminary was in fact an elaborate prison and extortion scheme dressed up as religious schooling. Very few channels are willing to tell this story because the Sterling family's reach still runs far deeper than most people understand. Before we go further into the tale of Father Edmund Sterling and his unholy institution, be sure to subscribe to this channel and tap that notification bell, because content like this is reserved only for true mystery seekers. And drop a comment letting us know, what state are you tuning in from? The Sterling family had long recognized that knowledge was the most dangerous thing one could inherit. Colonial Virginia in 1787 was a world of sweeping plantations, booming tobacco wealth, and dynasties whose fortunes depended on secrets better left undisturbed. The Tidewater region, threaded with winding rivers and cut-off estates, offered ideal shelter for those who preferred their dealings away from unwanted scrutiny. It was here in Henrico County that the Sterling family had built their standing as cornerstones of both commerce and religious life. Edmund Sterling, born in 1751, was the third son of a tobacco merchant whose fortune had been accumulated through methods polite society preferred not to examine. Unlike his brothers, who took over the family's above-board ventures, Edmund inherited something considerably more valuable, a penetrating grasp of human nature's most shadowed recesses, and a talent for exploiting them with cold precision. When he declared his intention to found a Catholic seminary in predominantly Protestant Virginia, his relatives interpreted it as an embarrassing bout of religious enthusiasm. They had no inkling it would become the cornerstone of the most profitable criminal enterprise colonial America had ever seen. St. Augustine Seminary was constructed in 1786 across 340 acres of thick woodland, remote enough from Richmond to guarantee privacy, yet close enough for wealthy families to pay visits. The Gothic stone structures, craftsmen imported from abroad, and an impressively stocked library lent it a convincing air of scholarly credibility. Edmund Sterling, who had studied briefly at the College of William and Mary before announcing a divine calling, fashioned himself as Father Sterling and assembled a small circle of staff whose backgrounds were every bit as murky as their present allegiances. Word of the seminary spread swiftly through Virginia's elite social network. Here was a Catholic institution helmed by a man of impeccable lineage, offering to take in young men who had become inconvenient for their families, sons who asked uncomfortable questions about business dealings, who had seen things they weren't meant to, or who held information capable of bringing family empires crashing down. The seminary promised not only education but discretion, seclusion, and above all, transformation. What these families failed to grasp was that Father Sterling had no genuine interest in educating their sons in theology. He was far more invested in educating himself about their family affairs, their financial arrangements, and most critically, exactly how much they would surrender to keep certain truths buried forever. The first students came through the doors in the spring of 1787, 12 young men aged 16 to 23, dispatched by families whose names appeared across shipping records, land registries, and government contracts stretching through Virginia and the Carolinas. Each family paid the considerable enrollment sum of £50 sterling, enough to construct a modest home, and pledged further contributions toward their son's spiritual growth. They believed they were purchasing discretion and redemption. What they were actually doing was bankrolling their own downfall. The autumn of 1789 brought the first signs that something at St. Augustine Seminary was deeply wrong, though it would take years before anyone could assemble the full picture of Father Sterling's enterprise. Jonathan Whitmore, eldest son of a Charleston shipping magnate, had been placed at the seminary after uncovering irregularities in his father's cargo records, irregularities suggesting the family's trade extended well beyond tobacco and rice. When October passed with no letter home, the Whitmore family sent their trusted overseer, Thomas Hartwell, to assess the boy's well-being. What Hartwell encountered at St. Augustine defied simple explanation. The seminary gave every impression of functioning normally. He could hear vespers drifting from the chapel, see lantern light in the study hall windows, and observe the rhythms of daily religious life. But when he asked specifically to see Jonathan, Father Sterling's reply was oddly deflecting. The young man was deep in spiritual retreat, Sterling explained, having undergone a profound awakening that demanded complete separation from worldly matters, family correspondence included. Hartwell, a man who had spent 3 decades managing the Whitmore family's more sensitive affairs, knew evasion when it stood before him. He asked simply to catch a glimpse of Jonathan during evening prayers, enough to assure the family he was alive and well. Father Sterling agreed, but attached a peculiar condition: Hartwell was to observe from the rear of the chapel, cloaked in shadow, and was not to attempt any contact whatsoever. That evening, as dusk settled over the stone walls of St. Augustine, Hartwell tucked himself into the chapel's back alcove. What he saw in the hour that followed would shadow him for the rest of his days, even if he never fully understood it. The young men processing into prayers moved with an unsettling uniformity, their faces carrying expressions of hollow serenity, almost vacant in their calm. They recited the liturgy in flawless unison, never glancing toward the visitors' section, never betraying the restlessness or individual character one would expect from young men confined together. Most troubling of all, when Hartwell counted the figures in the pews, he arrived at only 19, despite Father Sterling's claim of 37 students currently enrolled. Among those 19 faces in the flickering candlelight, Hartwell believed he spotted Jonathan Whitmore. But the young men who had departed Charleston as a spirited, headstrong heir now sat with the glazed devotion of someone who had forgotten his own identity. When Hartwell returned to Charleston and relayed his concerns to the Whitmore family, they found themselves confronted with an impossible dilemma. Their son appeared to be alive and in reasonable health, receiving the spiritual direction they had sought. Yet something essential in him had shifted, and pressing for his immediate return risked raising questions about why he had been sent away at all. The Whitmores chose silence, exactly as Father Sterling had calculated they would. They continued their payments to St. Augustine Seminary, reassuring themselves and their social circle that Jonathan had simply found his calling in religious service. It was a far simpler story to accept than the alternative, that they had handed their firstborn son to something far more sinister than the scandal they had tried to bury. In the months that followed, similar scenes unfolded across Virginia's web of powerful households. Sons enrolled at St. Augustine were writing home, but their letters carried a strange sameness in tone, formulaic expressions of devotion and contentment. Parents who came to visit found their children altered in ways that resisted precise description, more yielding, less inquisitive, possessed of an unsettling tranquility. None of these families compared notes with one another. The very nature of why their sons had been sent away ensured that silence was always preferable to inquiry. And Father Sterling counted on that silence as carefully as he counted the steadily rising fees he demanded for their sons' continued spiritual advancement. As the 1790s progressed, St. Augustine Seminary's standing among Virginia's aristocratic families grew, but always in hushed exchanges and veiled recommendations. The institution had carved out a singular place in colonial society, a destination for inconvenient sons that carried none of the social shame of public scandal and none of the permanence of disinheritance. The families who made use of Father Sterling's services found themselves entangled in a net of mutual complicity. Each had sent a son away for reasons that could never be openly acknowledged, creating a lattice of shared secrets that held them all in check. The Randolph family had enrolled their youngest after he uncovered his uncle's slave-trading routes, which ran afoul of both Virginia law and family reputation. The Carters dispatched their heir when he began asking about tenant farmers who had quietly vanished from their Rappahannock plantations. The Byrds surrendered their son after he witnessed a late-night gathering that tied his father to a string of suspiciously convenient deaths among business rivals. What none of these families understood was that Father Sterling was carefully cataloging every secret, every transgression, every fragment of damaging information that had driven their sons to his door. His private study, situated in the seminary's tower, held comprehensive files on each family's weaknesses, names, dates, locations, and first-hand accounts drawn from the boys' own spiritual counseling sessions. The conditioning process students underwent at St. Augustine was measured and deliberately staged. New arrivals were first placed in comfortable rooms and treated with apparent regard. They sat through genuine theological instruction delivered by Father Sterling himself, who proved surprisingly learned despite his dubious credentials. The meals were generous, the library well appointed, and the daily schedule structured without being oppressive. But within weeks of arrival, quiet changes crept in. Students would mention feeling unusually fatigued in their letters, attributing it to the demands of rigorous spiritual discipline. Their handwriting began to shift, growing more controlled and uniform. Their correspondence grew briefer and more formulaic, expressing gratitude for their family's foresight in sending them to so wholesome a place. What the students did not know was that their evening wine was being laced with carefully measured doses of laudanum and other opiates, available to those with the right medical connections. The quantities were calibrated precisely enough to cultivate dependency and docility without producing the outward signs of drug use. Combined with total isolation from outside contact and relentless reinforcement of their family's disappointment in their past conduct, the chemical influence gradually produced young men who were ever more obedient and ever less capable of forming independent thoughts. By 1793, Father Sterling had refined his system to the point where he could predict almost to the week how long it would take to erode a new arrival's resistance and reconstruct him into the compliant figure his family would expect to encounter on visits. The process generally ran between 4 and 8 months, depending on the student's temperament and the gravity of the secrets he carried. But Sterling's true mastery lay not in controlling the students, it lay in controlling their families. As months stretched into years, enrollment fees began their slow, relentless climb. What had started as an annual tuition of £50 sterling crept upward into the hundreds, then the thousands of pounds, each increase justified by expanded spiritual programming and advanced theological coursework. Families discovered they were paying not merely for their son's education but for the ongoing suppression of family secrets that had surfaced during those early counseling sessions. When parents challenged the mounting costs or requested their son's release, Father Sterling would gently surface details from conversations their children had shared during spiritual direction, details about business practices, family histories, or witnessed events that carried the power to ruin reputations and dismantle fortunes. The proposition was always framed delicately but left no room for misinterpretation: continue supporting their son's spiritual journey, or watch their family's darkest chapters become public knowledge. Most paid without further protest. By the winter of 1798, 11 years after St. Augustine's founding, Father Sterling's enterprise had evolved into something far beyond ordinary extortion. He had assembled what he privately called the Virginia Arrangement, a sprawling web of interlocking blackmail schemes that held nearly 24 of the colony's most powerful families in his grip. The system ran with mechanical efficiency. Students who had been in residence for several years were progressively moved from the main dormitories down to private quarters in the basement levels, ostensibly for advanced contemplative study. These underground rooms, hewn from the natural limestone beneath the building, were appointed well enough to avoid obvious evidence of captivity, yet sealed in ways that rendered escape impossible. Students confined to these lower levels rarely surfaced for communal prayers anymore. Their spiritual progress had reportedly advanced beyond the need for collective worship. Meanwhile, fresh students continued to arrive at regular intervals, sustaining the seminary's outward appearance of active operation while supplying Father Sterling with new veins of family intelligence and additional revenue. He had grown expert at identifying which young men carried the most perilous knowledge about their family's dealings, and those individuals found their spiritual retreats growing steadily, permanently, longer. The transformation of Charles Randolph, enrolled in 1796, illustrated Sterling's evolving methodology with a particular chill. Charles had been delivered to St. Augustine after discovering that his father's tobacco export business was functioning as a laundering vehicle for profits from illegal slave trading, in direct violation of Virginia statutes and federal maritime law. His early letters home carried the predictable complaints of strict discipline and homesickness. But as the months passed, his correspondence shifted dramatically, becoming an articulate defense of the very family business practices he had once condemned, including explicit endorsement of trading arrangements he previously found morally indefensible. When Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Charles's younger brother, visited the seminary in early 1799, he found a man reshaped into a fluent advocate for the family's commercial interests. Charles spoke with easy authority about crop rotations, shipping timetables, and labor management strategies designed to maximize profitability while minimizing legal exposure. His earlier moral objections to the family's slave trading connections had apparently been resolved through intensive theological study of biblical passages on servitude. But Thomas Jefferson Randolph was a more attentive visitor than most who passed through St. Augustine's gates. He noted that his brother's pupils remained persistently dilated despite the brightness of the visiting room. He observed the faint tremor in Charles's hands when he wasn't actively engaged in speech. Most revealingly, when Thomas casually mentioned the name of a childhood dog the brothers had cherished for 7 years, Charles showed not a flicker of recognition. These observations might have stayed private family concerns had Thomas Jefferson Randolph not made the decision that would ultimately unravel everything Father Sterling had constructed. Rather than confronting his family directly, Thomas set about his own methodical investigation into St. Augustine Seminary's true operation. Thomas was unusually well positioned for such an undertaking. As a junior partner in the family shipping business, he commanded access to commercial ledgers, correspondence networks, and trade connections spanning Virginia and the Carolinas. More valuable still, he had inherited his grandfather's discipline for meticulous record-keeping and his father's instinct for suspecting financial arrangements that appeared too tidy to be honest. Over the months that followed, Thomas traced the financial threads connecting St. Augustine Seminary to nearly 24 prominent families. He found that tuition payments had escalated well beyond any defensible educational expenditure, and that numerous families were making supplementary contributions for specialized services that were never clearly itemized. He uncovered shipping manifests showing deliveries to the seminary of unusual quantities of medical equipment, pharmaceutical materials, and construction supplies better suited to fortress building than academic life. Most significantly, Thomas began tracking the students who had supposedly departed St. Augustine over its 11 years of operation, through graduation, family retrieval, or other means. What he found was deeply unsettling. Of the 247 young men enrolled, fewer than 24 could be documented as having returned to their families or established lives elsewhere. The overwhelming majority had simply evaporated from all public records following their enrollment. It was at this point that Thomas Jefferson Randolph understood that his brother Charles might not be the victim of unusual religious conditioning, but of something far more irreversible. Thomas Jefferson Randolph's investigation took a perilous turn in the spring of 1799 when he realized he was not the only one asking questions about St. Augustine Seminary. Through his shipping contacts, he learned that several other families had quietly engaged investigators to look into the institution, all surfacing the same pattern: sons fundamentally altered, and financial demands that never stopped growing. But those families were running into the same wall Thomas had already struck. Investigating Father Sterling inevitably meant disturbing the very secrets that had driven them to send their sons away. Every thread pulled on the seminary's operation opened doors that most families had resolved to keep shut forever. The pivotal break came when Thomas made contact with Martha Henley, widow of a Williamsburg physician who had died under circumstances that raised uncomfortable questions in 1797. Dr. Henley had been one of a small number of medical practitioners willing to attend to patients discreetly, asking nothing about unusual injuries or conditions that prosperous families preferred to keep off the record. His patient files, which Martha had inherited alongside considerable debts, contained multiple entries for consultations conducted at St. Augustine Seminary. According to Dr. Henley's notes, Father Sterling had sought medical counsel on the prolonged effects of opiate administration in young men, specifically requesting guidance on dosages sufficient to create dependency and compliance without producing obvious physical deterioration. The records documented several visits to the seminary between 1794 and 1796, during which the physician had examined students exhibiting clear signs of chronic drug administration, though they were being presented to him as cases of spiritual melancholia or religious ecstasy. More disturbing still were Dr. Henley's final entries concerning St. Augustine, penned just weeks before his sudden death, officially attributed to heart failure. The physician had begun recording his growing unease about the ethical dimensions of his work with Father Sterling, noting that certain students he had examined appeared to be suffering from considerably more than spiritual distress. His last notation about the seminary was a single line: "The Sterling arrangement represents a fundamental violation of both medical ethics and human dignity." When Thomas Jefferson Randolph presented Dr. Henley's records to Martha, she disclosed that her husband had been preparing to bring his concerns about St. Augustine before colonial authorities in the weeks before his unexpected death. She had long suspected that his passing was bound up with his mounting moral objections to the work Father Sterling had required of him, but had possessed neither the evidence nor the social standing to pursue the matter. Together, Thomas and Martha began building a strategy to expose St. Augustine's true character, but they were working within severe limitations. Any public disclosure would devastate the families whose sons were being held there, including Thomas's own. They needed a path to liberating the students that didn't require destroying the secrets that had imprisoned them. Their solution was both ingenious and hazardous. Thomas would leverage his shipping business to engineer an apparently accidental discovery of the seminary's criminal activities by colonial authorities, while Martha would prepare the medical documentation of the students' condition to underpin legal proceedings against Father Sterling. But as they finalized their approach, a discovery upended everything they believed they knew about St. Augustine Seminary. Conducting a final review of Dr. Henley's patient files, Martha found a hidden compartment in her late husband's medical bag, and within it, documents that laid bare the true dimensions of Father Sterling's operation. The seminary was not merely imprisoning inconvenient sons and bleeding their families dry. It was systematically disposing of students who proved too resistant to chemical management or who possessed too much dangerous knowledge about their family's affairs. The documents contained detailed anatomical sketches and clinical notations describing what Dr. Henley had labeled staged accidents, procedures engineered to eliminate specific students while preserving plausible deniability. The physician had apparently been coerced into lending his medical knowledge to murders staged as accidental deaths, suicides, or natural causes attributed to the student's supposed spiritual afflictions. Among these papers was a roster of names, students eliminated across the seminary's 11-year history. The list contained 23 names, corresponding precisely to the number of death certificates issued for St. Augustine students. But more chilling still was a second roster marked pending resolution, which carried 12 names of students currently in residence, among them, Charles Randolph. Thomas Jefferson Randolph understood in that moment that his brother was not merely imprisoned at St. Augustine. He was scheduled to be killed. Just when we thought the depths of this story had been plumbed, the horror rooted in Virginia's hills reaches further still. If this tale is raising the hairs on your neck, share this video with someone who lives for dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support what we do here, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's find out together what unfolds next in this chronicle of corruption and greed. The race to save Charles Randolph and the other condemned students was now underway, but Thomas and Martha were about to discover that Father Sterling had been tracking their investigation from the very beginning. On the night of May 17, 1799, Thomas Jefferson Randolph and Martha Henley approached St. Augustine Seminary carrying a desperate rescue plan. What they uncovered in the limestone chambers beneath the building would leave its mark on the survivors for the remainder of their lives, and would expose the true architecture of one of colonial America's most systematic criminal enterprises. The basement levels of St. Augustine held not only cells for current students but a fully outfitted medical facility where Dr. Henley had been compelled to assist in what Father Sterling called spiritual interventions. The pharmaceutical stocks Thomas had traced through shipping manifests were being deployed not only to manage living students but to manufacture convincing deaths for those who could no longer be safely contained. Charles Randolph was discovered in the final phase of Father Sterling's elimination process, deeply sedated with opiates and presenting symptoms of deliberate poisoning designed to replicate the progression of consumption. His medical charts indicated he was expected to succumb to respiratory failure within the week, his death to be reported to the family as the tragic consequence of spiritual exhaustion compounded by a fragile constitution. But Charles was not the most harrowing discovery in the seminary's underground passages. Within a section of the basement that served as Father Sterling's private archive, Thomas and Martha encountered comprehensive records of the entire Virginia arrangement spanning 12 years of operation. The files documented not merely current students and their families but the full scope of Father Sterling's systematic reach into colonial society. The enterprise had grown far beyond straightforward extortion of wealthy households. Father Sterling had weaponized the intelligence gathered from imprisoned students to manipulate commercial transactions, political appointments, and legal rulings across Virginia and neighboring colonies. He held documentation of slave trading violations, tax evasion schemes, fraudulent land conveyances, and political graft implicating dozens of prominent families, judges, and colonial administrators. More disturbing yet was the finding that Father Sterling had been selling portions of this intelligence to British agents operating within the colonies, effectively transforming St. Augustine Seminary into a center for espionage directed against American commercial and political interests. The fees paid by families for their sons' education had been augmented by substantial sums from British intelligence services seeking compromising material on colonial leadership. But the most shattering revelation emerged from Father Sterling's personal correspondence with his British handlers. Those letters disclosed that the entire seminary operation had been conceived not merely as a revenue scheme but as a deliberate campaign to destabilize colonial society by compromising and controlling its most influential dynasties. The British had been financing St. Augustine Seminary as an instrument of their strategy to preserve their grip over American commerce and politics even as independence movements gathered force. The students imprisoned in the basement were not simply victims of individual family scandals. They were casualties in a broader struggle between competing imperial ambitions, sacrificed to sustain a British intelligence advantage over colonial society. When Thomas and Martha moved to evacuate the surviving students, they found that Father Sterling had been prepared for precisely this contingency. The seminary staff, who had presented themselves as unremarkable religious instructors, were in fact trained armed guards. The building itself had been constructed as a stronghold, with layered security at every level and weapons concealed throughout the facility. The confrontation that followed stripped away the last of Father Sterling's carefully maintained disguises. He was neither religious zealot nor ordinary criminal but a seasoned intelligence operative who had exploited religious authority and family desperation to build one of the most effective espionage networks in colonial America. You understand, Father Sterling told Thomas as his armed men closed in around the rescue party, that dismantling this operation means destroying every family whose secrets we hold. Your own family's slave trading violations alone would bring criminal prosecution, financial devastation, and a social disgrace that would shadow your descendants for generations. He gestured toward the files cataloging the Randolph family's illegal dealings. Your brother Charles carries intimate knowledge of shipping records, financial structures, and business relationships that could unravel not just your family, but scores of others throughout Virginia's commercial order. His continued existence poses a risk to operations that serve the Crown's interest in maintaining stability in these colonies. Thomas recognized that Father Sterling was not merely threatening individual families. He was threatening to detonate the entire facade of legitimate order that Virginia's elite society rested upon. The choice was not between rescuing his brother and shielding his family's name, it was between sustaining the fiction of colonial respectability and dragging into daylight the systemic corruption that actually kept it functioning. The decision is straightforward, Sterling continued. Allow us to conclude our arrangements with the students currently in our care, and your family's secrets remain protected. Move against this operation, and we release documentation that will bring down the name and financial standing of every prominent household in Virginia. But Thomas Jefferson Randolph had spent months arriving at exactly this confrontation, and he had not come to St. Augustine Seminary alone. Resolving the St. Augustine Seminary crisis demanded sacrifices that would reshape Virginia's political and social landscape for decades. Thomas Jefferson Randolph's investigation had carried him to a conclusion Father Sterling had never foreseen, that the only means of dismantling the seminary's operation was to expose the very corruption it had been built to exploit and perpetuate. Working alongside Martha Henley and a carefully assembled group of colonial officials who had discovered their own families were being compromised by Sterling's intelligence network, Thomas had devised a strategy that required surrendering their social standing in order to save their children and dismantle British intelligence operations across Virginia. On the morning of May 18, 1799, colonial militia forces conducted coordinated raids on St. Augustine Seminary, arresting Father Sterling and his staff of British operatives. Simultaneously, Thomas Jefferson Randolph and 17 other prominent Virginia families publicly confessed to the illegal commercial practices, political corruption, and social violations that had rendered them susceptible to Sterling's leverage in the first place. The public disclosures shook Virginia's social order to its foundations. Families that had commanded colonial commerce and political life for generations faced criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and social exile. The Randolph family's admission concerning their slave trading connections triggered the largest criminal investigation in Virginia's colonial history, ultimately exposing systematic violations of both colonial statutes and federal maritime law across dozens of prominent households. But the strategy succeeded. By voluntarily surfacing their own secrets, the families involved stripped Father Sterling of his primary instrument of control and neutralized the British intelligence advantage the seminary had been constructed to deliver. The confessions were coordinated with precision, revealing criminal conduct while shielding information that could endanger colonial military or political interests amid the rising tensions with Britain. Charles Randolph and 18 other students were brought out of the seminary's basement chambers, though their physical and psychological recovery would demand years of sustained care. The treatments administered during their confinement had left several with permanent neurological injury, and all struggled with opiate dependency requiring ongoing medical supervision. Charles never recovered full memory of the years preceding his enrollment at St. Augustine, and the personality alterations instilled in him, the compliance, the advocacy for family commercial interests, the absence of moral friction, never fully resolved. He retained the shape of the person Father Sterling had fashioned him to be. 23 bodies were recovered from unmarked graves on the seminary grounds, confirming that Father Sterling's operation had indeed been conducting the systematic murder of students deemed too resistant to manage or too knowledgeable to release. The victims came from some of Virginia's most storied families, young men whose deaths had been communicated to their parents as the sorrowful results of spiritual exhaustion, consumption, or other natural causes. Father Sterling himself vanished during the raid on St. Augustine. Despite exhaustive searches, neither he nor several of his closest associates were ever located, fueling persistent speculation that they had reached British territory or been extracted by their intelligence handlers. The question of his fate endured for decades, feeding a lingering dread that comparable operations might be running elsewhere in the colonies. The exposure of the Virginia arrangement sent reverberations far beyond the families immediately implicated. The revelations concerning British intelligence activities within colonial society intensified the fractures between American colonists and British authority, feeding the political currents that would carry forward into the conflicts ahead. Several families whose reputations had been consumed by Sterling's operation became fierce advocates for American independence, driven by determination to prevent future foreign manipulation of colonial affairs. More immediately, the scandal catalyzed sweeping reforms in Virginia's commercial and legal architecture. New regulatory frameworks were constructed to close the gaps in oversight that had made Sterling's enterprise possible, and monitoring systems were put in place for religious and educational institutions drawing students from multiple families. But perhaps the most enduring consequence of the St. Augustine Seminary affair was the change it wrought in how Virginia's elite families approached the raising of their children. The catastrophe demonstrated, with terrible clarity, that family secrets could be turned into weapons against those who kept them, and that protecting one's children sometimes meant surfacing the very scandals one had devoted everything to concealing. Thomas Jefferson Randolph never made peace with the knowledge that his family's prosperity had been built on systematic criminal conduct, or that his brother had been placed on an execution list to protect it. Charles survived his imprisonment, but the brotherhood that two men had once shared was permanently altered by what they now knew of what their family had been willing to sacrifice for social position. The ruins of St. Augustine Seminary stood vacant for nearly 50 years after the scandal, with local residents describing strange sounds and unexplained lights drifting from the abandoned structures. When the property was finally acquired for development in 1847, laborers discovered additional underground chambers that the original investigation had never reached, together with documents suggesting that Sterling's operation had been even broader and more systematic than anyone had understood. This story reminds us how the hunger for social standing and financial security can erode even the most fundamental ties of family loyalty and religious conviction. When families reach the point of sacrificing their own children to guard their secrets, they forge vulnerabilities that can be turned against them by anyone who grasps that desperation makes people capable of almost anything. What do you make of this story? Do you believe the full truth of the Sterling family's operation was ever uncovered, or might there be secrets still buried somewhere in Virginia's hills? Leave your thoughts below. If this tale stayed with you and you want more stories like it, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and pass it along to someone who loves a good mystery. The darkness of human greed reaches further than most people are willing to look, and it takes a particular kind of courage to peer into those depths. See you in the next video, where we uncover another story of how far people will travel when reputation and money are on the line.